The enemy had arrived, and humanity's last hope seemed far away. The world had always been a place of conflict, but nothing could prepare them for what was coming. It all started with a flash in the sky, a streak of light too fast to track, followed by the thunderous roar of something much larger than any natural force. People looked up in fear, not knowing what to expect, as the alien ships descended on Earth's cities. In the first moments, the world was shaken. Buildings fell, fires ignited, and the world seemed to stop in its tracks. The invaders came without warning. The aliens' technology was beyond anything humanity had ever seen. They didn't just come to conquer. They came to erase. The cities they struck were not just destroyed. They were obliterated. The death toll was unimaginable. Thousands, even millions, lost their lives in mere hours. Governments scrambled, but nothing could halt the onslaught. Air forces tried to intercept, but the alien shields were impenetrable, their weapons more advanced than anything humanity had ever hoped to build. The desperation was palpable. People across the globe watched in horror as their world crumbled. Families were torn apart. Entire countries were wiped off the map. Humanity had no way of fighting back, no way of knowing how to survive. The aliens were too strong, their numbers too vast. No matter how much resistance Earth's armies put up, the invaders always seemed to be one step ahead. In the midst of this chaos, one person stood out: Captain Sarah Lawson, a young military officer with a reputation for calm under pressure, watched the destruction unfold from a command center deep within a mountain. She had been preparing for war her whole life, but never like this. She had heard the stories, seen the movies, read the books, but none of that had prepared her for the reality of facing an enemy that was truly unlike any she had ever encountered. She had always believed that there was always a way to fight back, that there was always hope. But the truth was clear now. Humanity was losing. The situation seemed hopeless. But then a message came through the command center's emergency channel. It was garbled, broken, but clear enough to understand. "We have a weapon," the voice crackled. "A weapon that could turn the tide. But it's buried, hidden, and only one person can activate it." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. A weapon. Hidden. This was the first she had heard of it. How had humanity kept something like that a secret? Her mind raced as she wondered who knew about this weapon, where it was, and if it was even possible to access it in time. The aliens were already making their way to the next target, and the world had little time left. The voice on the other end continued. "The weapon is an ancient design, something from the very early days of humanity's exploration. It's unlike anything we've ever built, and it's more powerful than you can imagine. But we've lost contact with the team who was sent to find it. There's no time to waste." Sarah's heart pounded. A secret weapon. She knew that humanity had advanced in many ways. But this, she had no idea what kind of weapon could be so powerful. But it was humanity's last hope, and she had to find it. She looked around at her team, their faces grim, their eyes full of fear and determination. It was clear that they, too, understood the gravity of the situation. The enemy wasn't just winning. They were erasing them from existence. "Who has the coordinates?" Sarah demanded. There was no time for hesitation. If this was real, if this weapon truly existed, it was their only chance. A voice responded, shaky and filled with uncertainty. "We think it's in an underground facility near the ruins of New York City. But the area is heavily guarded by enemy forces. No one who's tried to reach it has returned." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "I'll go," she said, her voice steady, though inside she was filled with doubt. The risk was enormous. But what choice did they have? She turned to her team. "We're leaving now. Gather supplies and get ready for a fight. This is our only chance." The team quickly gathered their gear, and within minutes, they were on their way. The air was thick with tension. The world outside was falling apart, but here, in this small team, there was a flicker of hope. The mission was clear: get to New York City, find the weapon, and turn the tide before it was too late. The task was dangerous, the enemy overwhelming, but this was humanity's last stand. As the team made their way to the ruins of what was once a bustling metropolis, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on how quickly everything had changed. Just weeks ago, she had been leading training missions, preparing soldiers for conflicts that seemed so trivial compared to the scale of this war. Now, humanity was facing annihilation, and the only hope left was buried beneath the rubble. New York City had once been a symbol of humanity's power. It was a city of dreams, of ambition, of possibility. But now, it was nothing more than a shadow of its former self. The buildings were half collapsed, the streets littered with debris. The smell of smoke and decay hung in the air. The ruins told the story of a city that had been struck down, just like the rest of Earth. As they navigated the desolate streets, Sarah could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Every step they took was one closer to the weapon, and one step closer to danger. The enemy forces were everywhere, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next attack. But Sarah couldn't afford to think about that now. The only thing that mattered was finding the weapon and getting humanity's chance at survival. The team reached the location just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the destroyed city. The underground facility was just ahead, hidden beneath layers of rubble. It was an eerie sight. What was supposed to be their salvation, buried beneath a broken world. But time was running out. The enemy would be here soon. If they didn't act now, humanity's last chance would slip away. They descended into the depths of the facility, the air thick with dust and the remnants of a forgotten past. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to imagine what kind of weapon could be waiting for them down there. Would it be a super-powered bomb? A fleet of hidden ships? Something far more dangerous than anything they had ever imagined. They'd reached the heart of the facility, but the weapon was nowhere to be found. Panic began to rise within Sarah's chest. Had they been led on a wild goose chase? Was it just another false hope? Then, as if answering her unspoken thoughts, the ground shook. A low rumble filled the air, and a massive door slid open in front of them. Beyond it was a vast chamber, illuminated by a strange greenish glow. At the center of the room stood a figure, tall, imposing, and covered in intricate patterns. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a living thing, part machine, part something else entirely. Sarah stared in awe, her breath catching in her throat. This was no ordinary weapon. It was something far beyond human understanding, something from a time long forgotten. The weapon had been waiting, and now humanity's fate rested in its hands. But there was no time to waste. The enemy was closing in, and Sarah knew that she had to act fast. They had found the weapon, but would it be enough to stop the destruction? Would humanity's wrath be enough to turn the tide? The real battle was just beginning. As Sarah stood before the massive weapon, her heart raced. The glowing figure before her wasn't just something she could easily understand. It felt alive, almost sentient, its biomechanical structure pulsing with energy. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the machine, like it was waiting for something. The air was thick with the sense of something ancient and powerful, something long lost to time and rediscovered in humanity's most desperate hour. "Is this it?" one of Sarah's team members asked, his voice barely above a whisper. They had all seen weapons of incredible power before. Human-made bombs, energy shields, and high-tech drones. But this was nothing like any of that. This was something far beyond human creation. Sarah's mind raced. The voice from the emergency channel had said the weapon was more powerful than they could imagine. But how? What exactly was it? The figure in front of them was not something a regular soldier could control, and yet it was humanity's last hope. The fear of the unknown gripped her heart, but she pushed it aside. There was no time for hesitation. "We need to activate it," she ordered, her voice firm. "But how?" another soldier questioned, stepping forward cautiously. "What if it's too unstable?" Sarah didn't have an answer. She knew this wasn't going to be easy, but they didn't have the luxury of time to figure it out. The enemy was on their tail, and it wouldn't be long before they discovered the location of the weapon. "I'll try," Sarah said. "We don't have any other choice." She stepped closer to the figure, scanning it for any obvious controls or signs of activation. The more she observed, the more it seemed like the weapon was a hybrid of human technology and something far older, something alien. The intricate patterns on its surface glowed faintly, shifting like liquid metal. It seemed alive, and yet not. Then she saw it, an opening near the center of the figure, a small gap that seemed to pulse with a steady rhythm. It was almost like a heart, beating in time with her own. She reached out cautiously, placing her hand over the gap. To her surprise, the figure responded. The hum grew louder, and a surge of energy ran through her fingers, like a spark of electricity, but more controlled. The entire room seemed to come alive as the weapon began to stir. The walls shook, and the air became thick with tension. The weapon was awakening, but at what cost? Sarah stepped back, feeling an unsettling weight on her shoulders. She had made contact, but what would happen next? She didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. But before she could think further, the ground trembled, and a loud, distant explosion shook the facility. The enemy was getting closer. "Move, now," Sarah shouted, urgency in her voice. The team scrambled into action, gathering their gear and positioning themselves near the entrance to the chamber. They had to leave before the enemy arrived. But as they moved, the weapon's hum grew louder, and then, without warning, a bright beam of light shot from the weapon's core, cutting through the darkness. The beam traveled outward, disappearing into the sky. For a moment, everything was still, and then the earth shook again. But this time, it wasn't just a tremor. It was a full-blown quake. The room around them seemed to distort, as if reality itself was warping. "Get down," Sarah shouted, as pieces of the ceiling began to fall. The weapon had activated, and whatever it had done was far beyond their understanding. The team huddled together, ducking under cover as the facility seemed to collapse around them. Sarah's thoughts raced. The weapon was supposed to help them, to turn the tide of the war. But was it ready? Was it truly what they needed, or was it something that could destroy them all? She had no answers. She only knew that their time was running out, and whatever happened next, they would have to face it head-on. After what felt like an eternity, the shaking finally stopped. The dust settled, and the echoes of the destruction faded. The team slowly stood, surveying the damage. The weapon was still active, but it seemed to have stabilized. Its glow was no longer erratic, and the hum had turned into a steady pulse. "What now?" one of the soldiers asked, his voice filled with awe and fear. Sarah took a deep breath, looking at the weapon. "Now we fight. We use it to take back what's ours." But as she said the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The weapon had only just awakened, and already it had caused massive destruction. Was it truly on their side, or had they unleashed something they couldn't control? There was no time to find out. The enemy was closing in. The team quickly gathered their equipment and moved out of the facility. The ruins of New York City were even more dangerous now, with the enemy forces already beginning to regroup. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if the weapon had given them the advantage they needed, or if it had just set the stage for an even greater catastrophe. As they made their way through the destroyed streets, Sarah's thoughts raced. The weapon was humanity's last hope, but was it truly what they needed? The doubts gnawed at her, but she couldn't afford to entertain them. The enemy was closing in, and they had to be ready for whatever came next. They'd reached the outskirts of the city, where the remnants of the human resistance were gathered. The last pockets of Earth's military forces had formed a makeshift base, hiding among the ruins, waiting for their moment to strike. But the enemy had already begun to move in. Their ships filled the sky, darkening the sun. The battle was coming, and Sarah knew that humanity's survival depended on the weapon they had just awakened. But would it be enough? Could it turn the tide? Or would it be humanity's final mistake? "Prepare for battle," Sarah ordered, her voice steady. "We fight now. No more waiting." The soldiers geared up, preparing for the confrontation that would determine the fate of humanity. The weapon, whatever it was, would be their last chance, and they would fight with everything they had. As Sarah looked up at the darkening sky, she could see the enemy ships descending. The battle had begun, and humanity was ready to face its wrath. But the question remained, would the weapon be their salvation or their doom? Only time would tell. The battle had begun, and the sounds of war echoed through the ruins of New York City. The sky above was darkened by the enemy's massive ships, hovering like vultures waiting to strike. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she led her team into position, the weapon still pulsing with energy, standing behind them like an ominous presence. The hum from its core seemed to vibrate in the air, filling the silence with an eerie promise of power. She looked at her soldiers. They were tired, their faces marked by exhaustion and the weight of what they were about to face. But there was no turning back now. They were humanity's last line of defense. The weapon, whatever it was their final hope. The alien forces began to land. Giant ships descended, their hulking frames blocking out the sun. Their army was vast, creatures of unimaginable shape and size, their weapons glowing with a sinister light. They had the technology to erase humanity from the face of the earth. And now, they were coming to finish the job. Sarah's thoughts raced. The weapon had been activated, but they had no idea how to control it. No one knew what it would do, or even if it was truly on their side. All they could do now was hope. "Are we ready?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the rising panic in her chest. One of her soldiers nodded grimly. "We're ready, ma'am. We've got the best chance now, with the weapon." Sarah glanced at the towering figure behind them, the weapon that had seemed so alive, so mysterious. They had no idea what it was capable of. But it was humanity's last chance. The first of the alien forces touched down with a deafening thud. The ground shook as their feet hit the earth, sending tremors through the ground. The soldiers braced themselves, waiting for the inevitable clash. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal and smoke as the enemy advanced. And then, without warning, the weapon reacted. The ground rumbled, and a blinding light shot up into the sky from the weapon's core. It wasn't just a beam of light. It was a torrent of pure energy, pouring from the weapon like a flood breaking loose from a dam. The alien forces halted, stunned by the sudden eruption of power. "What the hell?" one of Sarah's soldiers muttered, eyes wide with disbelief. The energy from the weapon spread like a shockwave, tearing through the alien ships in an instant. The first ship exploded, its metal frame disintegrating into nothingness. The weapon seemed to target the very core of the enemy's technology, tearing apart their defenses like paper. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Could this be it? Was the weapon actually on their side? Or was it merely responding to the enemy as an instinctive defense mechanism? But before she could think further, the weapon released another surge of energy, this time tearing through the ground itself. The earth cracked, and a deep rumble filled the air. From the cracks in the earth, strange, alien creatures began to rise, things that were not supposed to exist. They were part of the weapon's force, an army of living weapons that had been hidden deep underground, waiting for a signal to awaken. The team was stunned. This was no ordinary weapon. It was alive, an ancient force tied to Earth itself, and it was responding to the alien invasion. It wasn't just fighting back, it was fighting for Earth. "Move, move, move," Sarah shouted, snapping her soldiers out of their trance. They had to act now. The enemy forces were beginning to regroup, and the weapon might not hold out forever. The battle erupted in full force. The weapon's strange, monstrous creations began to clash with the alien invaders, fighting with a savagery that shocked even Sarah. The creatures were fast, powerful, and relentless, tearing through the enemy's ranks with terrifying efficiency. But the aliens weren't going down without a fight. They retaliated with their advanced weapons, firing beams of energy that cut through the air. The ground shook with each explosion. The sound of gunfire and screams filled the air as humanity's soldiers fought alongside the weapons' creations, pushing back against the alien forces with everything they had. But Sarah knew it wasn't enough. The enemy was vast, their numbers endless. Even with the weapon, even with these creatures, they were still outnumbered and outgunned. And then, in the midst of the chaos, Sarah saw something she hadn't expected. The weapon's figure, still towering behind them, began to move. It shifted, its glowing core pulsing with an even more intense energy. The energy crackled in the air, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. Time itself seemed to freeze. The weapon wasn't just a tool. It was a living entity, a force of nature that was now fully awake. It reached out with its long metal limbs, and with a sudden surge of power, it unleashed a wave of destruction. The ground tore apart beneath the alien forces, and the very sky above them seemed to crack and burn as the weapon unleashed its fury. The enemy ships began to plummet from the sky, falling like burning meteors, their crew disintegrating in the wake of the weapon's energy. For a brief moment, it seemed as though they were winning. The weapon was unstoppable, and humanity's forces, powered by this strange and powerful entity, began to push the aliens back. But then something unexpected happened. The weapon faltered. Its energy began to crackle and flicker, the light from its core dimming, as if it were running out of power. The weapon's massive form began to sway, and Sarah could feel the earth tremble beneath her feet as if it, too, were struggling to keep up with the incredible power it was releasing. "Get back!" Sarah shouted, realizing that something was wrong. The weapon was unstable. As the soldiers retreated, the weapon's energy surged one last time. But this time, it wasn't directed at the enemy. The beam of energy shot up into the sky and then split, a crack in the air that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality itself. For a moment, everything stopped. The weapon's energy stopped, the creatures it had summoned stopped, and the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, with a final thunderous roar, the weapon released one last surge of energy that cracked the sky and split the ground beneath their feet. The battlefield went silent. The enemy forces were gone, their ships destroyed, their creatures disintegrated. The weapon, its energy spent, was still, its once glowing form now cold and dormant. Sarah stared at it, her heart heavy with uncertainty. Had they won? The enemy was gone, but at what cost? What had they unleashed? What had humanity awakened? The answer would come later. For now, though, there was only silence, and a world that had been saved but was forever changed. As Sarah turned to her soldiers, she knew that the battle was over, but the war was far from won. Humanity had survived this invasion, but at what cost? The future was uncertain, and the true nature of the weapon was still unknown. But for now, at least humanity had won the first battle. And that, for the moment, was enough. The dust began to settle, and the silence that followed the final surge of energy from the weapon felt unnatural. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, the ground was still. The battlefield, once filled with the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and screams, now lay in eerie quiet. Smoke billowed from the ruins of what had been a fierce and desperate fight. The alien forces were gone, their ships reduced to debris scattered across the sky, and their monstrous creatures nothing more than ash in the wind. But as the soldiers began to regain their footing, the weight of the situation began to settle in. Sarah stood in the center of the chaos, looking around at the destruction. The city, once a symbol of humanity's strength and ambition, was now nothing more than a shadow of itself. Its buildings crumbled, its streets littered with wreckage. Yet in the midst of all this ruin, humanity had survived. They had fought back, and they had won. But at what cost? The weapon, the strange, ancient force that had been humanity's last hope, had done its part. But now it was still. Its core, once glowing with an intense energy, was dim. The massive figure that had awoken to fight was now lifeless, its once powerful limbs stilled. Sarah could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing on her chest. What had they unleashed? Was this truly the weapon that had saved them, or had it just been a temporary solution, an unknown force that they couldn't fully understand? Her soldiers gathered around her, their faces grim, but also filled with awe. They had seen the weapon in action, witnessed the power it unleashed, but like Sarah, they had no answers. It was clear that the weapon had turned the tide of the battle, but the question remained, could it be controlled? And if it could, should it be? Is it over? One of her soldiers asked, his voice filled with uncertainty as he gazed at the wreckage around them. Sarah shook her head slowly. I don't know. We've won this battle, but the war is far from over. She looked around at her team, her mind racing with the implications of what they had just experienced. We need to figure out what this weapon is and what it means for humanity. The team set to work, cautiously investigating the remains of the weapon. There was no sign of any control panels or systems that could explain how it had worked, or even if it was possible to use it again. It was as if the weapon was not designed for human hands. The energy it had unleashed had been primal, powerful, and beyond their understanding. No matter how much they tried to examine it, there were no answers. We can't just leave it here, another soldier said, his voice filled with a mix of fear and awe. What if it wakes up again? What if it's just waiting for something? That's exactly what I'm worried about, Sarah replied, her brow furrowed. She took one last look at the weapon. We need to secure it. We need to understand it before we make any decisions. As the team began to secure the area, Sarah's thoughts drifted to the larger picture. The alien forces had been repelled for now, but they hadn't been destroyed. This was only one battle in a much larger war. The invaders would regroup. They would plan, and they would come again. Humanity had barely survived this time. What would happen the next time they attacked? And then there was the weapon. What would it do now? Had it truly been a weapon designed to protect humanity, or had they unleashed something far darker? The power it had unleashed was like nothing they had ever seen. Could they control it? Should they? Suddenly, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see one of her soldiers, a young woman with a serious expression on her face. Ma'am, the soldier said quietly, we've got company. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Could the aliens have come back already? She turned to see what the soldier meant. In the distance, a group of figures was moving toward them. They were humans, survivors from the remnants of the resistance forces. But they weren't alone. Behind them, there were military vehicles, and Sarah saw the familiar markings of high-ranking officers. It wasn't just any group. It was a delegation sent by the surviving governments. These were the people who had been making the decisions from the shadows, the ones who had been directing humanity's efforts to resist the alien invasion. They had been waiting for a chance to regroup, to take back control. But now, they were here. Sarah approached them, her team falling in line behind her. The lead officer, a tall man with a stern face and graying hair, stepped forward. He had an air of authority about him, his uniform impeccably maintained despite the chaos around him. Captain Lawson, he said, his voice cold but respectful. I trust that this means the battle is over. For now, Sarah replied cautiously. We've won this fight, but the war is far from over. The enemy will return, and we need to be ready. The officer's gaze flickered toward the weapon behind her, still standing tall in the distance. And that? He asked, a note of concern in his voice. Sarah glanced at the weapon, her eyes narrowing. We need to secure it. We don't understand it fully yet, but it helped us win. It's humanity's last chance. The officer seemed to consider her words for a moment before speaking again. The weapon is a mystery, but we don't have the luxury of time to figure it out. The aliens will come again, and when they do, we need to be prepared. His eyes hardened. That thing needs to be contained. We can't let it fall into the wrong hands. Sarah's stomach twisted at the words. The officer wasn't just worried about the weapon's power. He was worried about control. What if this was the beginning of humanity's own downfall? What if, in their desperation, they had unknowingly created a new enemy? She opened her mouth to protest, but the officer raised a hand, cutting her off. "We're taking over now, Captain," he said. "You've done your part, but the war isn't over. We'll take it from here. We'll secure the weapon, and we'll start planning our next move." Sarah's mind spun. This was the moment of truth. Humanity had survived, but how would it move forward? Would they be able to control the weapon they had just unleashed, or would it become their downfall? The officer's words rang in her ears as she considered the consequences of what had just happened. "I understand," Sarah said, her voice low. "But we need to be careful. The weapon is powerful, yes, but it's unpredictable." The officer gave her a thin smile. "We'll handle it. You've done enough." Sarah nodded stiffly, watching as the delegation moved forward. Her thoughts raced, and the weight of uncertainty pressed down on her shoulders. The weapon had saved them, but at what cost? Humanity had won this battle, but would it be enough? As the dust began to settle and the future loomed uncertain, Sarah knew that this was only the beginning. The enemy was still out there. The weapon was still out there. And humanity's true test was only just beginning. In the end, she didn't know whether they had truly won, or if they had simply awakened a new kind of war. All she knew was that they had to fight, because if they didn't, humanity would lose everything. The fight for survival wasn't over. It was just getting started. Weeks had passed since the battle, but the weight of the victory still hung heavily in the air. The remnants of New York City had become a symbol of humanity's resilience, a place where the final battle had been fought, and where the future of Earth now rested in the uncertain hands of the weapon they had awakened. The streets, though scared and broken, were now filled with the hum of reconstruction. Humanity had survived, but that survival was fragile, dependent on something far beyond their understanding. Sarah stood on the balcony of a makeshift command center, looking out over the city. The destruction was still visible, the wreckage of alien ships scattered in the distance, but there were signs of hope too. Small pockets of humanity were rebuilding, helping one another, and the once quiet streets were now alive with activity. However, Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of her mind. The fear that the weapon, the thing that had saved them, might also be humanity's greatest threat. The delegation that had arrived in the aftermath of the battle had taken control of the weapon almost immediately. They had brought in scientists, military strategists, and engineers, all tasked with studying the weapon. But no one had been able to unlock its secrets. The weapon was beyond their comprehension. It was alive in ways they couldn't explain, a fusion of human and alien technology that seemed to respond to instinct rather than any known system of control. The higher-ups had made it clear. The weapon would be secured, contained, and used only when necessary. But Sarah had a feeling that containment was impossible. She had seen the power of the weapon firsthand. It wasn't something that could be controlled or tamed. It was something ancient, something far beyond what humanity was ready for. But they had no choice. The enemy would return. It wasn't a question of if. It was a question of when. "Captain Lawson," a voice broke through her thoughts. Sarah turned to see Colonel Harris, a seasoned officer who had been by her side through the most intense moments of the war. His face was grim, his eyes filled with the same uncertainty that had been haunting Sarah for weeks. "We've received word from the resistance," Harris continued, his voice low. "The enemy is regrouping. Their forces are reorganizing on a distant moon. They're not finished, and they know what we've awakened." Sarah nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. And now, with the weapon in play, they were facing an enemy more dangerous than they had ever imagined. "They know about the weapon?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. "They do," Harris confirmed, "and they're coming for it. The weapon might be our greatest asset, but it's also our greatest vulnerability." "Where's the weapon now?" Sarah asked, already knowing the answer. Under tight security. But it's only a matter of time before the enemy figures out a way to breach our defenses. And when they do, we won't be able to stop them. Sarah's mind raced. She had to get to the weapon. The security surrounding it was already heavy, but it wasn't enough. The aliens wouldn't just try to destroy it. They'd want to control it, harness its power for themselves. And if they succeeded,